And the first thing to do in the render view is choose a render node. So I will go to this choose rock and I will specify Mantra 2. And you can see that automatically and progressively it gave me a render of my scene. And notice this button here, which gives you direct access to the parameters of your render node. Let me close this window again. This render view has a lot of very interesting features. Let me, for example, go to my material palette and let me create a basic surface. I will take this down a little bit. I will make its color red so it's easily recognizable. And now what I will do is I will take this material I've created and I will drag it and drop it onto any object in my render view. So let me drop it on my torus, for example. I'll drop it here, and now you can see that my torus is directly rendering red. So if I go back to my scene view, you can see I'll get rid of the render region tool, and you can see my torus is red, and if I select it, I go to its material tab here, and we find that Shop Basic Surface is now assigned to it. Let me go back to my render view. Now what if I have this render view window in a maximized mode and I want to change the parameters of the material assigned to my torus? Instead of me minimizing the window and going back to the parameters of the material assigned to the torus, what I can do is just hold my control button on my keyboard and click on the torus. And the parameters window of the material assigned to this torus will automatically open. So if, for example, I take this red color and I make it blue, I'll close the windows, and you can directly see that my torus has become blue. Now what if I'm interested, for example, in updating just a part of my image? What I can do is just hold down the Shift key and drag a region in my render view. And now, I'll minimize this window. If I change this color to green, for example, you can see that the part of my torus inside this region updated, and the part outside it didn't update. So I'm only updating the region inside this rectangle here. And if I want to get rid of this updating region, what I have to do is hold down the Shift key again and click outside of my image boundary here. The region will disappear and the render will update the whole image again. Now, there are other features that may be also useful, like this snapshot, for example. Let me take a snapshot of my current image. I'll click on this camera icon here, and then I'll change the color of my torus back to red. Now my torus updated in my render view, but if I use those plus minus buttons here, let me click on this minus button, you can see I got back to the image I saved with this snapshot button. And here comes another interesting feature, which is this comparison tool here. If I, for example, right click here and choose diff, or click on this button, you can see a slider appeared here, and if I begin playing with it, I'll take it left, and you can see my torus now is showing me a part of the image I saved with the snapshot tool and a part of the current render. There are many comparison modes, like if I right click on this icon here, you can see there are some options outside of my screen, but we have split horizontal, split vertical, compare, subtract, blend, etc. So you can use any of them to compare the two images you have if you need to. So if I take this slider and I take it to 0, I will have the whole old image, and if I take it to 1, I will have the whole new image. And you can also use this slider directly inside your render view. If I click with my mouse inside my render view and I drag left and right now, you can see that I'm changing the amount of mixing between the two images. So let me now turn off this tool, and other interesting features of the render view, let me show them because they are not showing by default. So let me click on this small arrow here, and I will right click and show the view bar. In this toolbar here, you can view each channel alone, like the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, the alpha, etc. And you have also some color correction tools for brightness, for contrast, for gamma. You can specify black and white points, you can load an LUT, etc. And on this view bar here, you can zoom in, zoom out, you can home your view, you can choose between many image planes if you have them, etc. And now, since I'm talking about such features, let me talk a little bit about mPlay, which is the image animation viewer that ships with Houdini. By default, in your render nodes properties, let me go back to my render nodes, I'll go to my output, and I'll choose Mantra 2. In the properties of my render node, you have this IP tag here. This IP means mPlay Interactive, and that means that whenever you render with this node, the render will open up mPlay and will display the render there. So when I hit render, that's why you can see mPlay pop up. And here in mPlay, you can already see some common features with the render view, like those color buttons here, like the color correction buttons, the LUT load button, the zoom tools, the image planes menu, the histogram button. Here I don't have an interesting histogram because my image doesn't contain a lot of data. Let me make my grid a little bit bigger, and then I will go to my out and I will render the image again. And here, if I display my histogram, you can see some data showing. If you go to image, compare images, you can see also the comparison tool, which is almost the same like the one I have in my render view, but it has that menu here which lets me choose which frames I want to compare. And if I want to get the same functionality in the render view, I will have to use the plus minus icons to choose the first image for comparison, and on the bottom of the comparison mode menu I can choose the second one. One other common thing, for example, is this small information window. Let me show it in the render view. I'll turn off this comparison tool and I will hit I on my keyboard. And you can see this small information window that pops up and which gives me some information about the pixels it passes on. The same tool can be found in the mPlay window. Let me turn off the comparison tool. I'll hit I again and you can see the small information window that popped up here. We can see some other tools also in mPlay, like if I right click and show those display options. Here we can load a background image, we can show rulers, we can magnify zones of our image. If I get my mouse onto my image, you can see in this window that appeared that my image is now magnified, and other tools. You have the play bar here, you can have an audio bar, etc. So as you can see, mPlay has a lot of tools that you can use. Let me close this window for now. I'll hit I to hide this window. Like everything in Houdini, you are not restricted to this out context to create your render nodes. Let me show you, for example. Let me go to my object context, and here, let me get this a little bit bigger. Here I will hit Tab, and under Managers, I will create a ROP network. And now, if I go inside this ROP network, I will hit Tab again, and here you can see a render menu similar to the one that exists in the default out context. Let me create a mantra node, and now, as I did for the other mantra nodes, I will just click on this render button here, and you can see I've got a render. Let me close this window, and let me go up again. Here on this ROP network, we can find in its parameters those two buttons. If I click on this render button here, I get the same render I got when I clicked on the render button of the inside mantra node. And now, the interesting thing about this button and this button, let me go back inside my ROP network, and here I will create another mantra node. So now I have mantra 1 and mantra 2. I will close the mPlay window, and now pay attention to the small information window which will pop up here. I will click on this render button, and now you can see this information window is saying mantra 1, then mantra 2. So if we look at mPlay, now with one button click, we got the render of this mantra 1 and of this mantra 2. So if you look on top of my image in this information line, you can now see it's saying obj ROPNet 1 mantra 2, and if you click on this minus button, you can see obj ROPNet 1 mantra 1. So I rendered both my render nodes just by clicking once on this render button here. Now you can obtain a similar behavior in the default out context. Let me close the mPlay window. I'll get back to my out context, and here let me show my mantra 1 hidden node, and let me, for example, connect the output of mantra 2 to the input of my mantra 1, and then I will select my mantra 1 and I will hit on this render button. And here the same we saw earlier, it says mantra 2 then mantra 1, and if I look to my M-Play, now you can see out Mantra 1, and if I click on this minus button, you can see Mantra 2. So now once again I rendered both render nodes with the click of one button. There is one interesting thing about this setup, it's that it obliges the render nodes to render in a specific order. So for example, now I connected Mantra 2 to Mantra 1, and that means that Mantra 2 will always render before Mantra 1. And that could be very interesting if you have some render nodes that depend on other render nodes. So you link them like that, and then you will be sure that the render nodes that should be rendered first are rendered first. The same sequential setup can also be done in my ROP network. If I get back to my ROP network and I connect Mantra 1 to Mantra 2, and I render Mantra 2, let me close M-Play before, and I render Mantra 2, you can see Mantra 1, then Mantra 2, and here in my M-Play, you can also see obj ROPNet 1 Mantra 2, and when I click on this minus button, you can see obj ROPNet 1 Mantra 1. So my Mantra 1 node rendered before my Mantra 2 node. One last thing I want to mention before ending this introductory chapter to rendering is that, let me go to the parameters of my render node, and under Properties I will go to the Rendering tab. Here what I want to say is that Houdini has mainly three algorithms: the micropolygon rendering, the ray tracing rendering, and physically based rendering, which may use micropolygon rendering algorithm or the ray tracing rendering algorithm. Later we will have a technical chapter in which we will tackle all these things. But for now, remember that you have many render tools you can use, which are the render region tool, this render button here, the flipbook render for previews. You can create your render nodes. Don't forget to get them a valid camera to be able to render them. And you can also use this render menu for your renderings. And don't forget about the render view, which is a very important tool also. Next, I will introduce the scene we will be working on, and we will continue with our tutorial.